Yeah, this is a great turnout. I was really so honored to come here and talk to you about this book. I haven't read a YA novel that just swept me up like this in such a long time. I'm kind of like a dork for theme and structure. And the thing that jumped out to me about this book, besides the beautiful writing, is how the love story between the two main characters mirrors the external world building that's happening, kind of that tension between the upper city and the lower city and the rebels. And it plays, so it weaves together, those two stories weave together and just play off each other so beautifully. And it's all just wrapped up in this almost framed story of the storyteller who sort of pops in every once in a while to narrate things, and it just gets all tied up at the end. And the plot junkie in me was like, yes, oh, this ties up so well.
I'm so glad it was
satisfying. It was really truly moving, and just such a powerful story. So thank you so and much. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Do you want to get us started off with a little reading?
Yeah, I would love to. So I'm going to read from really early in the novel, a chapter that is from Paz's perspective and that kind of sets things up in a nice way. So you kind of get a sense for the rest of our conversation. So Paz. When first we met, prisoned together in that cellar room, he was my enemy. He was a smooth-handed boy, a full-bellied boy, a boy from Upper City. Las Oscuras had roughed him plenty. They'd taken his rich boy clothes and gadgets and tossed him on the bench across from me. His skinny brown chest was tatted and bruised, and his face was swollen. A long drip of spit and blood and tattoo ink dangled from his lip like a slimy spider web. He couldn't have been much older than me. Las Oscuras hadn't beaten me yet, just tied me up in that cellar room and left me to listen, while in the house above, the boy shrieked like a demon cast into the light of God. I wondered when my turn to scream would come. Las Oscuras. My city feared their name more than they feared Sabrang or chems or bombs. Insurgents, some called them. Terrorists, murderers. Their inked up faces haunted our forests, and their presence hung over our city like a never lifting fog. Most were too scared to even speak their name, but I wasn't so sure. In the twists of my guts and the holiest corners of my heart, I wondered how it would feel for their badge to burn on my skin, to be part of something big and powerful, instead of pushing all alone against the cold, new moon tides of the world. Gray light leaked through the floorboards above, and I peered into the cracks to try and catch sight of the tattered guards of Las Oscuras who stood there waiting. But the ropes that bound me made it so I couldn't move without tipping the bench where I sat. Hijo de puta, I said into the dark cellar air. Across from me, the Upper City boy's swollen eyes opened to slits. Hello, he said. Is someone there? He could scarce see a thing through the dark, couldn't see that I was tied up, same as him. Shut it, flaco, I said, my voice coiled like a snake. Shut it, or I'll tat you again. I'll tat your eyes. The boy flinched. That was all it took. The wobbly bench beneath him pitched sideways, and he fell to the ground. His face rammed into the dirt of the cellar floor. I laughed. There you go, I said. Eat your filthy tears. Taste them, just like you made us taste them. They're bitter, no? Bitter with tiredness and hunger and fear and I searched for the words that would break this boy's body, that would mend the gash his people had torn in the world. But there were no words for such things. Who are you? The boy asked. My name is Paz, I said, then added, something you know nothing about. I'm Rumi, he said. I stayed quiet. I didn't want to hear his story. I didn't want him to know mine. Paz, that means peace, right? It means peace. Paz, please, why am I here? Tell me what they want, please. You are the worms in my belly, Flaco. You are the dirt in my mouth and the boot on my neck. Why should I tell you anything? Please, he said, his face pressed into the floor. Please. He started to cry and writhe against his bindings, quiet as a snake on fire, and I smiled. This boy's ancestors had built the walls. His kin had told us to eat dirt because they wouldn't give us their bread, to drink the ocean because they'd poisoned the rain. He was a filthy cerdo, a greedy little god, and he deserved to die.
Thank you. That was beautiful. So I want to talk a little bit about the idea for this book, because you do have such strong, compelling characters, and their growth is such a big part of this story. Did you start with them and their love story, or did you start thinking of the premise of the book?
Yeah. So the book started, and this is always feels like a little bit of a cop-out, but it came from a dream. It was a dream that I had, and I'll take a couple of steps back to say why it was such an important dream. But so half of my family is Cuban American. And so in my teens and early 20s, it was really important to me to kind of reconnect with that side of myself. And so I spent a lot of time traveling in Spanish speaking countries. And one of the places I went to was Chile. I had a freelance writing gig working for a small Latin American based travel guidebook. And it was the first time that I had been in a Spanish speaking place where I actually was able to have those really complex, deep philosophical conversations in Spanish, which was this huge goal for me. And so it was just a really important formative moment. And so I came back from that time really just kind of buzzing with all of that energy and those conversations and everything. And really shortly after I came back, I had this dream. And it was the kind of dream that like sinks into your bones, and you can't really forget it. And it was a dream of this city that I had been based in, Valparaiso, which is this gorgeous, vibrant, art-filled city that is amazing and wonderful and bright, and everyone should go there. But the dream was really sinister and dark and kind of this place felt really dangerous, and it just was really compelling to me. So I jotted down all the details when I woke up, and it didn't really leave. And so I kept asking myself questions into that space, like who lives here? And how did this city come to be like this? And Paz sort of emerged out of that series of questions. And then I was like, well, this city doesn't exist this way in isolation. There's forces that are keeping it this way. And so Upper City kind of came to me through those questions. And then I was wondering who lives there and what would it be like to be young in that place and to never have seen outside. And so it was the place that came first, and then the characters, and then the story.
Oh, great. Were you already a writer? You were obviously a travel writer, but were you writing fiction at that point, or did you know that this was the future you wanted?
Well, I always wanted to be a fiction writer, like since I was, these guys will tell you, since I was, my parents are over here and they will tell you that since I was very, very young, that was a dream of mine. But I'd only ever written short fiction up until that point, and kind of had always thought I'd love to write a novel, but never felt I had an idea that was quite the size of a novel until this one. Yeah.
So thinking about those two characters, Rumi, the boy who comes from the upper city, the privileged upper city, and Paz, who comes from the rural countryside, which one of them, we heard you say you started with Paz. Did you feel most connected with her while you were writing it, or was one of them easier to write than the other?
It was really different because Rumi's voice is a lot closer to my voice, and Rumi's, experiences are in some ways, I'll feel a little bit closer to that experience than with Paz. But Paz, actually, once I kind of found her voice, it was easier to slip into because it was so different from my own. I don't know if you've found that with your own writing, that when something is quite different and you find it, it's like really easy to go back in. And with Rumi's being so a little bit closer, it was sometimes hard to figure out where his voice started and mine ended. But once I found it, both of their voices, I feel like, are pretty distinct. and I connect with different things about each of them, like Rumi's sense of wanting to see behind the veil of his world. Like that was kind of my way in for his character motivation. And then Paz's sort of righteous anger at like the state of things, like, why does it have to be this way, was kind of my way in for her. So I had different access points, but I wouldn't say, and the voices were different in terms of finding them, but I wouldn't say one is necessarily easier. I really connected with both of them.
Yeah. I do feel like you can find a piece of yourself in every character you write. But I have had that problem where I'm writing a character that is a little bit similar to me, and it's actually harder.
Yeah.
And I think for me, it's because I feel like, is this character interesting because I have lived these things and this is interesting to me? Like, would it be interesting to other people? Whereas if you're writing someone totally different, it's like objectively more, you know what I mean?
Right. They're totally different challenges.
Yes.
But they're both challenging in different ways. Yeah, totally.
So YA novels a lot of times get criticized for like kind of having a reductive look at the world, especially dystopians, like everything is very black and white. And I think you did such a wonderful job of not falling into that kind of trap that sometimes happens with dystopians. So we have, the oppressed ruling class, and then the rebels out in the countryside. And, at first glance, it's like, this is a story we've seen before, but as we get into it, it's just, there's so much nuance happening with both groups. And, the rebels are not all good, and the oppressors are, they're complex as well. And so I think that is like such a strong quintessential setup for science fiction and YA. Were you thinking about that in terms of like a message you're sending to young readers about those power structures as you were writing, or was that just kind of, did it naturally emerge as a theme?
I think a little bit of both. Yeah, I think that kind of reading a lot of stories where there's such a clear good and evil, and there's like just this one character that's up against everything else, and they have to have this like hero's journey where they overcome and defeat the evils of the world. Like, that's a really compelling story and a lot of fun, and like, but I thought, don't young people also want to hear stories where there are these complexities that are closer to their lived experience? And yeah, in doing a lot of just reading as I was writing this, reading a lot about just sort of mental health in young people around like their vision of the future and what's coming, and there's a lot of anxiety in, I think that maybe the sense that like they feel that they have to be the saviors or something, like this generational sense of like, well, there's stuff that's really messed up and we have to be but like, that's a lot to put on a person. And especially when the stories that you're fed are very much about this one person saving the world. And so this story is more at this human scale, I think, where it's two characters who make these really big life-changing decisions for them, but it's about changing their own lives and their communities, and not necessarily about just like saving the world, which is unrealistic as like an experience for a young reader. So I think, those stories, like I said, are fun, but I thought there would be a place for this kind of story as well, that's more nuanced and complex, where the right thing isn't always obvious.
Yeah, I think that's well put. It's sort of a very fine, or it's not a fine line. There's a big gap between youth today feeling apathy for the situation, that there's just nothing they can do to affect it, or feeling this pressure to be the chosen one and savior, like you were saying, And so I think like literature like this that kind of shows them different paths that they can navigate.
And it's about
where they want to make change in their lives.
The change doesn't happen with either both of them make these big decisions, but it's when they kind of come together and form this connection that they're actually able to affect real change in each other's communities and in their own. So yeah, that connection is really important to you.
And so the story's told from three different perspectives. You've got Rumi's and Pas's, and they're the biggest ones. But then you also have the storyteller, who's sort of this unnamed narrator who pops in. And it is almost a story within a story kind of framework. Why did you choose to tell it in that structure?
So it's kind of an interesting backstory for that one, because the original draft of the novel didn't have the storyteller as a narrative voice. She was a character in the story, but she wasn't, she didn't have chapters of her own. And then I had a full draft of the novel, and it ended in a certain way, and I wasn't entirely happy with the way that it ended, but my hands were sort of tied. And I don't know if you've experienced this, where you have created this world and these characters, and at a certain point there are decisions that you can't make anymore, and it doesn't feel true to the story if you try to just like say, well, I don't want it to end this way, it just doesn't work. And so I had to kind of go back to the beginning and think like, well, who does have that power? Oh, it's this storyteller. She actually has a different kind of power than I do. And so I let her be the force that kind of shifted subtly the way that the story kind of unfolded. And I won't say more than that because I don't want to spoil anything, but there's multiple interpretations for the ending. I've had different readers be completely convinced that one thing or another happens, which I think is awesome. But I think it has a lot to do with what you think about the power of story, and that affects what you think happens at the end.
I might have to secretly talk to you about that later. So on that note, I do run into that problem a lot, because I am a heavy plotter, and when something seems like it'll work on a one-page outline, and then when you translate it into an entire book and the characters, you learn more about them and they kind of want to take their own path, you don't want to force it into that narrative just for the sake of what worked in an outline.
For sure.
And so are you more of the plotter type, or are you what we call a pantser, which is where you just like fly by the seat of your pants, like you sit down and just free write?
I'm a hybrid plotter pantser. So I do a lot of world building, and like I've got all of these supplemental documents and folders that have timelines and characters notes and all that kind of thing. And then I don't plot out each chapter, but I do have kind of a sense of where things are, or I think things are going to go, up until like maybe 3/4 of the way, and then I have no idea. And so it's really fun when you get to that moment, because like I said, you've kind of got some constraints on yourself about where the story can go, and so then the story kind of drives itself a little bit at that point, and you discover it, which is, it's just an interesting experience. It's less about like, okay, I'm writing this story, and more like I'm uncovering this story. So I really like the moment where it turns to that more pantsy thing, but I can't start that way.
That's very similar to my style
cool.
as well. Yeah, I try to do like a rough outline just so I sort of have a direction to go, but allowing for enough flexibility. And then I'll more tightly plot like 5 chapters at a time, and so then it's sort of like, okay, I can see this story for the next 50 pages or so. And then when I reach that point, I'll do plot out the next 5 chapters and go on. Yeah. I would love to know a little bit more about your own history with Cuba and Chile, and how you chose to write it, and how you sort of worked that in your personal history and interest in the area into the book.
Yeah. So yeah, like I said, I had this drive to kind of reconnect to that Latina side of myself, but Cuba's a really complicated place, and it's not that easy to go there and stay there for a long time. And I knew that I needed to have that more immersive experience to be able to connect in that way. And so like Chile was one of the places where I was able to be for a long period of time. And when I was there, a lot of the conversations that I had actually got super political in a great way, like in an invigorating way. And so I had very little knowledge about the really specific geopolitical history that's shared by the US and Chile. When I went there, I had kind of a very surface knowledge, and I got a deep education in that. This education in the way that imperialism was affecting Chile in the present day. And I actually ended up going back to Chile again while I was drafting the novel, and kind of took a deeper dive into some of those questions and themes. And one of the neat experiences that I had that kind of informed the novel was I went to the South. I had previously gone north, and I went south, and was in this little farming community, and met this older man, and he was kind of like just sharing his life story, because that was just what seemed to happen. It was so cool. Like all these conversations that I would have would be just like deep outpourings. And he was sharing about his experience in opposition to this hydroelectric dam that was going to be built in his community. And the community fought back against this large multinational entity, and they succeeded, and the dam was not built. And he was sharing with me how, like, well, the dam was going to be built so that they could send the power up to the north for the mining, which was then, you know, again, an extractive industry that was not Chilean owned, because under Pinochet, like, all of the resources in Chile were privatized and were not owned by people who are from Chile. And so it was just like this very eye-opening experience, indicative, that story was indicative of a lot of the things that I hadn't really realized when I had first come. And those kinds of stories deeply informed the kind of message, I guess you would say, or the themes of the book. So I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think that spirit is definitely in the book for sure. You know, the details are different, but it's
Right.
definitely the same spirit for sure.
A sense of like, yeah, the impacts of colonialism and imperialism, but also the way that a single community can come together and have an actual impact.
Yeah, the power of the people.
Yes.
That's really,
Yeah. So I was trying to put that.
yeah. So the sci-fi aspect of it. There's so much cool future tech that I kind of geeked out over. They all wear, or the people in the upper city wear specs, which are sort of like those Google glasses. And the kids can't even remove them, which I thought was such a kind of terrifying idea. So they're really forced to see the world that, you know, the powers that be want them to see. You know, and then you had things like heliocycles. And so how do you approach thinking about future tech? Like, how do you come up with all of that stuff?
Yeah, so it was kind of a mix of like wanting it to be somewhat believable as a development of the technology we have now in terms of AI and renewable energy and surveillance and all of that stuff. But it was also, you know, about thinking about the world that this particular society would create. So it wasn't necessarily about trying to predict the future, like, oh, we're gonna have these, you know, but it was making it realistic in that way, but also, or as realistic as I could, but also having it reflect the values and the way that this particular world was structured and the way that it viewed its citizens. And so, yeah, with the specs, it's not optional. Like, you have to wear these things whenever you're out in public, and they are a window for surveillance. But people don't seem to mind because it's like also augmented reality, and it's cool, and it feels like you're opting in. And so there's this sense of like, well, we're all just kind of fine with it, you know, and that is definitely, you know, just part of the world building. And the sense of the way that this society functions. It's not a totalitarian, oppressive regime in Upper City. It's sort of everyone's feels like they're choosing it, even if they're not. Yeah, so
very sinister, echoing a lot of like Black Mirror-esque stuff.
Yeah,
About,
I love Black Mirror.
might be a little too close, but yes. And so part of the sci-fi aspect too is the question of biological warfare. And I don't want to get into too many spoilers, but there's that question and questions of vaccines and contagions and things like that. Was this a book that you wrote during COVID? Was that whole experience? Okay. Because it just had that in common. And I was like, wow, that's something that's just so relevant. I wonder if you were writing it at that time.
I wrote it a long time before COVID. And we actually, my editor and I worked somewhat furiously and diligently to differentiate, because we wanted to very much make it clear, like, this is not supposed to be a world that I envisioned coming out of COVID, you know, like, it was also sort of I started querying for this book in 2020, and I was a little nervous because like, does anybody want to read about viruses? You know, like, is that something that people want to read about right now? Luckily, publishing takes so long that, you know,
Right.
it wasn't 2020 when the book came out, but yeah, I mean, there are definitely some eerie things that are similar in terms of, you know, this sense that in some ways, like the rebel group is trying to use this virus as a way to remind people of their shared humanity, but it actually ends up being, you know, this, the result is a extremely divided, almost completely separated and cut off world. And that's, you know, it's just a little bit like, and there are ways that it feels a little too close to home in the unequal way that the virus affects different communities, and that just, yeah, definitely, there are some echoes that were not intentional and were not planned in my writing, but are there.
And I think it's certainly not a pandemic book. That's just one aspect of the future warfare situation that they're finding themselves in. And I didn't think to myself like, oh, this reminds me of COVID. I thought more like there's certain elements you weave into the book, like the specs, like the biological warfare, where I'm like, I can see glimmers of this now in the present, and I could see how it could be a bigger problem in the future. And so like with the mentions of the, you know, vaccines and the virus spreading and everything, I was like, oh, it's like, I get it, because we all just went through that.
Right.
But it didn't feel like a COVID book.
No, it was interesting because when I was writing it, there were some parts that, like, I was talking about different strains and how it would mutate and think, and I'm like, oh, everybody knows that now. Like, it does. Everybody, nobody needs an education in that particular aspect. But yeah, it's the pandemic in the novel is backstory. It's not an unfolding pandemic. It's sort of, this is the aftermath of something that happened in the not too distant past of the book.
Well, great, thank you. I would love to take some questions from the audience for Lauren, and we can also have some people on watching from home as well, and the lovely people here will tell us those questions. Any questions?
So you mentioned that the publishing world is really slow.
Yes.
How long did it take when you were done before it actually came out and we're holding this in our hand?
So the time that it took between when I started querying and when the book's in our hand was 3 years. The time it took between when I wrote it and now, or when I started writing it and now, is 10 years, because I kept putting it down. I have some perfectionist tendencies, and so I kept, well, who among us has that? But I kept putting it away and taking it back out, messing with it, and then it was in 2020 that I had a little nudge from my husband that said, it's good, just send it out, you know. And so I did, you know, I just kind of took that little leap, and it was a good idea. But yeah, the publishing world, from the time that a book deal was signed until it was out, was 2 years. And then it was about a year of querying, getting submission lists together, and all of that. A little less than a year of that. Yeah.
Or did you set out to write a YA book, or did it evolve into that category of reader?
Yeah, so I had none of the short fiction that I'd worked on was anything close to YA. It was very kind of weird, formal experimentation stuff that was not anything like this. And then this story came to me, and I just knew it was a YA story. I just sort of had the characters and the arc of their journey and the things that they were thinking about, the things that were important to them. It was just very much YA. And so it was the story that kind of set. And so I didn't actually have much knowledge of YA. I hadn't read all that much YA when I started writing it. And so I had to kind of do my research and find the kinds of YA authors that I was kind of wanting to write in a particular way. And so I had to scramble a little bit because it wasn't a audience that I was actually familiar with. But luckily, it took me 10 years to write it, so I had plenty of time to
So I'm wondering about Rumi's character specifically. It seems like Paz kind of sprang forth with his very clear voice. And Rumi is of a different ethnicity, different culture, obviously, in many, many ways. So how did you decide sort of about his ethnic background and what kinds of research did you do there? Because he's
So he comes from the world of this novel. There's been a series of wars, and he comes from North Pakistan, but he's never been there. His father has never been there. His grandfather grew up there, but only has childhood memories. And so he has this kind of diaspora experience where I actually feel a lot of that same with a different culture, obviously, but I have a lot of that same sense of like a longing to get back to something that actually doesn't really exist anymore, and like having these little cultural touchstones that help to get closer, but like that you'll never get fully there. And I wanted him to be from a different part of the world because I wanted this this global union of upper cities, it to be clear that people were chosen from different parts of the world to go to different cities. And so I wanted to make sure that he was from a really different part of the world. And when he came to me, his name was Rumi. Like he came to me with that name. And so I'm like, oh, I must learn about where he comes from and, you know, like what his life is like and what sort of his grandfather carries with him poetry and some cultural and like culinary like connections, and his grandfather sort of the receptacle of that cultural memory for him. And so that was like a really important relationship for me because Rumi feels not as close with his father and feels much more closeness with his grandfather because of that connection to the past and to their cultural background. Does that kind of answer what? Yeah.
Any more questions?
To know what writers inspired you on your journey.
Yeah. So I answered this question a week ago, and I kind of identified this like holy trinity of three writers that I think just I carry with me, but also are like deep under this novel. And so Jorge Luis Borges, who is the short story writer from Argentina, but who like the kind of kernel at the heart of his stories is a question or an idea. And I find that that's where I get my stories from, is a question or an idea. I know a lot of people, they have character, they have like a certain kind of plot, and mine is more like a philosophical question or a wondering. And his stories are just like, were some of my very first favorite stories that I ever read. Italo Calvino, who also does short stuff and long stuff and plays with form, but his use of language, just the like way that he relishes language and just seems to just be overcome with the beauty of the world. That was always something I wanted to be able to emulate, because I would read a sentence of his and just be like, oh my God, this is so good. I have to put it down, I have to read it aloud because it's just so beautiful. Cosmic Comics is like the one that really hit home for me of his, and that's short fiction. And then Ursula Le Guin, more for the kind of taking things into a more science fiction realm, but also very motivated by these kind of like, well, what if this, you know, what if the world was like in this way, and motivated in by those kinds of questions. For this particular book, Paolo Bacigalupi, who writes climate engaged fiction from a really just like, he just writes really gritty near future stories, but that involve a climate altered world. So that was someone that I used as an example, and he writes young adult and adult fiction. And then Lainey Taylor was someone that I read while I was working through kind of the more relationship, romance, young adult side of things, because she does that beautifully. And then Taylor K. Mejia has a book called We Set the Dark on Fire that I also kind of used as an example in terms of the way that the kind of rebel political group works. And so that was kind of a little bit of an example for me. But that's more specific to this book, and the others are more specific just to my life as a writer. So I'll always carry them with me. Sure.
One, was there a big challenge or a couple big challenges that you feel like haunted you or kind of kept coming up as you were writing the book, and what are those? And then two, obviously you talked about your connection to Latin America. Was that something that you imagined, in starting the book that you would connect with so much, or was that a goal, or did that evolve, or was that part of the reason for writing it, or did that evolve sort of as you were writing and spending more time in that?
I don't know exactly. It's sort of like chicken and egg. Like I had carried these questions with me, and then I started writing, but the stuff that I had written previously, it didn't really engage with that quite as much. And so it wasn't until I started traveling and reconnecting actively with that side of myself that this kind of direction, that I found this direction. So yeah, I don't know exactly what caused what, but it kind of happened simultaneously. And then Rumi's first chapter, man, I wrote that thing 40 times. I just was trying to find different ways in, and that chapter was the one that I kept having to revise, or the first 3 chapters really, just because there's so much that you have to do in terms of world building and establishing character. And when you're writing this kind for YA, and it has to be like there, right, accessible from the beginning, and the pacing has to be there, and the story has to kind of take off. And so that was challenging, but I'm pretty satisfied with the way that it is.
Sequel will take 10 years.
I would love to write a sequel, and we'll see about that. It will not take 10 years because I've learned a lot from this. Yeah, I've learned a lot about in terms of craft, and just in terms of like, just get it out there.
And
But
the ending is a bit open to
it
interpretation.
is open,
So-
yeah, and I believe you've read the ending, so you know the kind of openness. But I would love to write a book that is within the same universe, carries some of the story, but also goes into some of the history of how the world came to be this way. So it would be really fun.
Yes.
Question, and this is like, I know a lot of writers, there are a lot of writers in this room. What are the moments that you celebrate as writers? What are some of the moments, especially for folks who maybe here haven't been through the journey of published? What are the ones that you can remember from you that you were like, or yay, or whatever?
Yeah, I think like a lot of writers, including myself, have a tendency not to celebrate when we should, because it always feels like there's another step. It's like you finish the first draft, but then you got to do the second draft, and then it's publishing, and then, and so definitely whenever I finish a first draft, to me, that's like a huge sigh of relief. And I feel like, okay, like a huge chunk of this story is here. The story exists. It might not be good, but it exists. So that's always a cause for celebration for me. Specific times, signing with my agent. I used to work for Asheville Parks and Rec, and I got the call from an agent saying I'd gotten this 3-book deal, meaning I could quit my job, and my boss was super supportive. He knew I wanted to be a writer, and I ran into his office and I was like, I quit. And he was like, yes. And that was like, that was just like a huge celebration for sure. Yeah.
Having the agent, I think, was like, that's so important, because even though you don't have a book deal yet, you have someone on your team with you who's like in your corner. And that was just a hugely affirming moment, because you're finally not alone.
Yeah, to get some validation. This is not a job where you get a lot of validation.
No, yeah. But yeah, I was sharing that this really small milestone, but that felt really important to me, was I sent my middle school English teacher a copy of my book, this past week, and that was a really wonderful moment that I celebrated. I was like, because he was, he was an impactful figure in me kind of understanding that I wanted to be a writer, and so getting to send a book to him with a little note saying thank you was like very important. It was a tiny celebration, but it actually meant a lot.
Final questions, the virtual
I have
audience is.
one more
Oh,
because
okay,
I have these really cool stickers in my book.
Hang on just a second. So our virtual audience is a little shy, so we don't have any questions from there. But just wanted to see if you wanted to talk for just a moment about your plans for this tour. You're on tour in air quotes, and what you're learning from.
Yeah. So I this is my official launch, but it's not my first event. I've been doing some events around North Carolina and some virtual events. And what I've learned is it gets a lot easier the more you do it, the more you talk about it. The first one I was so nervous and felt all clammed up, and now I feel like, oh, I can talk about, I wrote this book, I'm an expert. I have lived my whole life as me. I could talk about this, and so it has gotten a lot easier to kind of do, and it's really fun to see friends and people I don't know come out and yeah, get to talk about books. It's pretty amazing.
And
And
we had one wrap-up question.
Oh,
Yeah, I
okay.
have these cool stickers. I want to know about them.
yeah, so
But my neighbor here doesn't have these
Yeah,
stickers
I
in her
guess
book,
I'm
so
not
she's want to know.
my friend who I thought she was going to make it tonight, but I don't think that she was able to come. She is an artist out in Hot Springs, and she made these beautiful lino cut prints that were inspired by some images and stories that the storyteller tells in the novel. This one is, and everybody will get one. If they want to get a book, they can get a sticker. This one is The City of the Sky and the City of the Sea. And then this one is The Fish Who Ate the World. And they both are based on stories from the novel. And so we made them into stickers, and they fit really beautifully on the title page of the novel so you can, where it says Under This Forgetful Sky here, just fit it nicely right there. And you peel it off and it looks like it's an actual print because it's clear. The white will come away and it'll just be clear. So her name's Lydia Wynn, and she's Dance on the Whale is her kind of social media handle. And these are wonderful, and I was so grateful that she made them, and everybody can get these. Thanks for asking about that.